Hello and welcome to Truthout TV, the video series that spotlights writers who contribute to truthout.org. I'm Ted Asregadoo, and this week my guest is Christopher Petrella. He is a PhD candidate in African American Studies and Education at UC Berkeley. Christopher has also penned a widely read piece on Truthout entitled The Legacy of Chattel Slavery. Private prisons blur the line between real people and real estate with new IRS property gambit. Hey, Christopher, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Hey, in your article, you quote from a Virginia slave code of 1705 that makes it explicit that slaves were real estate. Now you flash forward to the present, and now private prisons are essentially classifying prisoners as real estate. They're doing this by reclassifying themselves, with a little help from the IRS, from a Class C corporation to what they call a real estate investment trust, or Reit. Can you explain the difference between the two? Like, what's the difference between a Class C corporation and a Reit?
Sure. So that's an excellent question. So a Class C corporation essentially is a typical corporate designation. Most major corporations that we hear of on the news every day are organized as Class C corporations, and they file with the IRS as Class C corporations. A Class C corporation is essentially a corporation that is controlled by shareholders. The owners, a lot of the sort of directors of the corporation aren't directly liable, and the corporation will pay the an effective income tax rate to the U.S. government of anywhere between 20 and 35% or so. A Reit designation is a little different in the sense that it lowers a corporation's tax liability to zero in exchange for providing shareholders and investors with essentially 90% distribution of profits on an annual basis. And the IRS, I should sort of preface this by saying, Reits were developed in 1960 under a piece of legislation that was signed by then President Dwight D. Eisenhower, essentially to provide, you could say, average investors, non-affluent investors, with access to real estate investment. And these REITs, essentially, the sort of categories of qualification for a company to file as a REIT are as such. So A, they need to distribute 90% of their profits in dividends to their shareholders every year. 75% of their total assets must come from real estate, and 95% of their gross income has to come from real estate related investments. And so in the last few investor presentations that have been published both by the Geo Group, which I referenced in the article, which is the second largest private prison company in the United States, and as well CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, which is the largest publicly traded private prison company in the United States. Both of these companies are stylizing themselves to their investors as real estate intensive companies, where, and to quote the latest actually CCA investor presentation from this morning, as a matter of fact, they say that real estate is an essential service that we provide. So I think it's a little curious, Ted, because what a lot of these private prison companies are doing right now is stylizing themselves to the IRS in a way that's quite different from the way they stylize themselves and quote-unquote market themselves to state departments of corrections with which they contract, as well as federal agencies like the Bureau of Prisons, ICE, and U.S. Marshal Service. So they're kind of, in some ways, riven internally, and they're sort of beginning to lead a fairly schizophrenic organizational sort of existence.
It's kind of at a point where, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Sure.
You talk about in your article about the correlation between private prisons and African Americans in those private prisons. What is that correlation?
Right. So, I should say that the article in some ways was an extension of a study that my colleague Josh Begley, who is a graduate student at NYU, and I recently completed. in which we found that in 3 states that have extraordinarily large populations held in private prisons, those states being California, Texas, and Arizona, people of color are overrepresented relative to their already represented status in public corrections facilities. And so I wanted to sort of make a case study out of Virginia, particularly since I framed the article in terms of the Virginia Slave Code of 1705. And so what I ended up finding through a little digging was that the only GEO-owned and operated, it's actually a GEO-operated prison in Virginia called Lawrenceville, has an overrepresentation of African Americans to a degree of about 20% relative to all of the other corrections facilities in Virginia. And so it's a curious sort of designation. It's a curious disproportionality, and I wanted to illuminate that for Truthout readers in the last piece.
Now, you mentioned that there's you showed at least that there was a connection between the private prisons and an overrepresentation, at least in the one prison that you looked at in Virginia. Now, what about lobbying by corporations like the GEO Group to change state laws so they can essentially have a steady supply of prisoners to their facilities? Have you been finding anything in your research about that?
Yeah, there's ample lobbying that's gone on. I mean, I think one of the best resources for interested parties, readers, policymakers alike, actually is the website Open Secrets. Obviously, they track lobbying efforts, and I think they've chronicled the lobbying of CCA and GEO Group for at least the last 10 to 12 years. And so it's clear to see that both GEO and CCA have spent over $10 million, particularly lobbying, actually I should say particularly lobbying against one specific law. And that law is actually, it's a federal piece of legislation that's been introduced since 2005. It's called the Private Prison Information Act. And essentially the law, if passed, would require private prison companies like GEO and like CCA to comply with Freedom of Information Act or FOIA standards, like their public counterparts. And so over the last 5 years or so, both companies have spent over $12 million lobbying against this effort. The last time it was introduced, it died in subcommittee. And so, in fact, my colleague Alex Friedman and I at Prison Legal News are spearheading a national campaign to ensure that this bill gets reintroduced in the 113th Congress, essentially because we feel that if taxpayers and public officials are going to be in a position to make any reasonable assessments of equivalency as to the efficacy of public versus private facilities, then this information needs to be at the public's disposal. So lobbying assuredly exists among both of these companies.
Well, I sometimes think about the type of laws that are being violated, or how prisoners wind up in prison. And the most, I would say, the most visible law within the country is the prevalence of 3 strikes and you're out laws.
Sure.
Here in California, you're in California, I'm in California. The overcrowding of prisons is due in part to laws like that. Now, sure. in your case study in Virginia, or at least when you're looking at the prison in Virginia and private prisons in general, and the lobbying efforts of those corporations to change the laws, are they trying to specifically target lower income communities, people in lower income communities? So because these are generally people who don't have the wherewithal to fight any kind of charge. So they end up in prison, and they may get a public defender, right, and wind up in prison based on either the way the law is written, or that they don't have as zealous of an advocate as they would hope. Right. But are you finding that there are certain types of laws that are being lobbied for, or is that a little too off the mark of what you're working on?
Well, no, it's not off the mark. I think I'm always I think I approach a lot of these questions actually fairly conservatively, And my sense is that lobbying in the Commonwealth of Virginia has existed. It does currently exist, but it exists in ways that are sort of facially, racially, and economically neutral, right? So there is no, in my view, there are very few instances when corporations like CCA and GEO are targeting specific communities for imprisonment. But the point is that the laws for which they advocate tend to target specific communities. So the reason that these companies have been sort of modestly successful is precisely because they're able to sort of capture a certain segment of the population in a subterranean way. So to answer the question more specifically, we would really need to sort of discuss it on a state-by-state basis.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess there can't be a sort of an overall campaign that blankets the states. But so I guess it does depend on the interests of the corporation and their ability to influence state governments and bend laws to their advantage, if you will.
That's right. Or at the same time, I could say, or just encourage particular state governments to adopt a privatization policy, which is happening right now, both in Vermont and New Hampshire. In fact, if I could just take a moment, Vermont actually is in the process right now of introducing a piece of legislation. It's called H-28. It's sponsored by a rep from Burlington. And if this bill is enacted, it would effectively ban the state of Vermont from contracting with private prison operators, both in-state and out-of-state, because currently Vermont, viewers may not know this, particularly because it's a bit paradoxical that one of the most conspicuously progressive states in the country actually ships about 35% of its prisoners to Kentucky and houses them in a private CCA-owned facility there. So essentially, this law would bring these prisoners back home and prohibit future incursions into prison privatization. There's a similar law in New Hampshire right now that would effectively ban private prisons. New Hampshire doesn't utilize private prison contracts right now, but there was a request for proposals that the state legislature of New Hampshire made about a year ago, and it was a request to privatize all of their prisons, which would make it the first state in the country that would have sort of ubiquitous privatization. And there are efforts there to stop this. But the reports that I'm getting, because I've been to both states offering testimony, is that lobbyists are in full swing there, and they're doing their best to make sure that both of these bills get defeated.
Which brings back to the initial role of prisons in society. I mean, are they for correction or rehabilitation, or are they there to punish? And then there's this added wrinkle: are they there for profit? And
right.
And there's a curious case of something that happened when I was getting ready for the recording of this interview, and I was looking at the article that you wrote in Truthout, and you have a paragraph in there that says, and I'll read it: over the last 6 months, the GEO Group has assiduously lobbied the IRS, claiming that it meets Reit eligibility criteria.
Right.
Fundamentally, GEO is in a real estate intensive industry, and GEO has attractive real estate characteristics, reads an excerpt from the most recent investor presentation. Right. One that leaves out all mention of rehabilitation. Yet, when I checked the GEO Group's profile right before we recorded this, the profile that you linked to on the Truthout piece, they have it listed that they do provide the following: youth rehabilitation services, and it says we develop and manage medical and mental health rehabilitation facilities and services. Now, is it possible that the GEO Group revised their profile after the publishing of your piece on Truthout on February 4th?
It's certainly, I mean, it's certainly possible. I hadn't checked. It had been a while since I'd been to the GEO Group's main page, but that wouldn't necessarily surprise me. They're in particular, the GEO Group is a pretty inscrutable company, and I've made a a variety of efforts to contact them in the past, as well as CCA. And I have to say, I actually have to say, to CCA's credit, they've begun to answer some of the questions that I've had, whereas Geo Group has completely marginalized me and a lot of other journalists I know working on these issues. So it's entirely possible.
I mean, I found it very, very curious is probably the mild form of saying I was somewhat shocked, because I looked at your piece and I saw that you had linked to their profile, and I found that, wait a minute, this kind of almost kicks a leg out from your argument here. And I don't know if you're going to go back and revise the piece on Truthout to say that, that there's language now in the company profile that does mention rehabilitation or not.
Right. Well, I think we've, over the past few years, and I would say really over the past year or two, private prison companies, particularly CCA and Geo, have come under a lot of public scrutiny, and there are a lot of journalists out there doing excellent work. For example, Chris Kirkham over at Huffington Post just, I think, about a week ago, in fact, reviewed CCA's latest audit report from the state of Ohio, and found that the Lake Erie facility, CCA's owned Lake Erie facility in the state of Ohio, achieved a state compliance level of about 66%. Right. So there's already sort of a critical mass of criticism and critique. And my sense is that this is how these companies respond, by slowly but surely sort of being able to sort of manage dissent and criticism by incorporating that dissent and criticism back into their mission statement. And I think I should say this is particularly relevant in the case of the status of a real estate investment trust, because CCA in particular has already tried this in the past. You may be aware that back in the early 90s, in fact, Corrections Corporation of America converted to a real estate investment trust, and it almost bankrupted the company. They almost went under. What ended up happening was that a subsidiary of CCA known as Prison Realty Trust broke off. It organized itself as a real estate investment trust. It benefited from these various federal and state level corporate tax breaks. And CCA was very quickly able to expand its investor pool by virtue of offering increased dividends to its shareholders. So it took the surplus cash on hand that it had, and it started to build prisons on speculation in California, in Utah, for instance. And what happened was that the CCA couldn't actually convince state departments of corrections in a timely manner to fill these facilities. And so CCA and its subsidiary, as a real estate investment trust, almost went under. Their shares around the year 2000, their shares were actually valued at $1 per share. And so it'll be fascinating to see what changes, if any, CCA makes this time around. This is the first time, to my knowledge, Geo's been in this position. But I'll be interested to track both carefully. And just as an aside to your listeners, CCA officially converted itself to a real estate investment trust this morning. I listened in on their investor conference. This comes about roughly 2 weeks after Geo did the same. So I'll be curious to track this.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. And one of the things that I think it highlights is the power of not only corporation, but corporate lobbying, because they do have a lot of money behind them. And
that's right.
For people who would read your piece on Truthout and dig a little deeper and find out about private prisons and essentially the prison industrial complex, what sort of tools are they going to have to be able to combat that kind of money, those kind of deep pockets, to influence state legislatures? And I think journalism plays a vital role in that, but I think that there's another piece to that, and that is people being organized in such a fashion that they try and push back against the changing of laws and the way in which it seems like we're moving backwards to maybe 1705 Virginia in some ways, because now that prisoners are being classified as real estate, well, that's not very different from when slaves were classified as real estate. And I think that the more people read about this, the more shocked they will be. And I hope that they will organize in some fashion to push against the intense lobbying efforts of private prison corporations. And I really appreciate that you took the time to talk to me today on Truthout TV and to highlight your piece. And it's very widely read here on Truthout. And we hope that you'll contribute more and more to the publication.
Great. Thanks, Ted. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Christopher, for being on the program.
All right. Take care.
Christopher Petrella is a PhD candidate in African American Studies and Education at UC Berkeley and a contributor to Truthout. And that's Truthout TV for another week. I'm Ted Asregadoo. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.